Do you want to hear something brutally honest? Most people fail that IB interview in the first few minutes because when they're asked, tell me about yourself, they give an answer that could belong to anyone and the interviewer checks out. And after that, you're fighting an uphill battle. In this video, I'll show you how to tell your personal story in a way that guides the interview instead of killing it. And if you're new here, I'm Harris Amir, and I've been an investment banker here in London for the last 6 years. So let's start with what this question is actually testing. So when you're asked to walk through your background, the interviewer is actually trying to determine 3 things very quickly. Does this person's path make sense? Is there real substance behind what they're saying? And why does this role make sense as the next step? So this isn't small talk, it's a filtering question, and a strong answer frames the rest of the conversation, whilst a weak answer puts you on the back foot. Now, most people treat this as a recap of their life. I see this all the time with our clients at Charter Mastery. They just rip off a monologue and there's no narrative, and often it's not even personal. Strong candidates treat this as a story with direction, and the story follows a simple structure, and that structure is the OSAL framework. OSAL stands for Open, Spark, Action, Acceleration, and Land. And this is the framework that underpins the rest of this video. So let's start with Open. And this is where you are right now. Your job is to anchor relevance straight away in one sentence. So you tell the interviewer what you currently do or what your situation is right now in a language that makes sense in the context of this role. This is not a resume summary, it's orientation, and if it takes longer than 10 or 15 seconds, it's too long. And we're going to look at a good and bad example shortly, but what I want to emphasize is that this should be factual and essentially call out points that are relevant to the role you're applying to rather than being emotional. And let's look at what I mean by this. So a good example is I'm currently working in an FP&A role focused on budgeting, forecasting, and performance analysis. And if you're applying for a banking role, budgeting, forecasting, performance analysis, these are things that are somewhat relevant to what you're applying to. Now, a bad example would be, I'm a highly motivated and analytical person with a strong interest in finance. This is super generic. It's sort of emotional, or motivational, like I'm highly motivated and analytical. It's not grounded in reality. It's not grounded in facts and not directly linked to the sorts of characteristics they want to see. Now, after the open, which is essentially the present, we go all the way back to the foundation and spark, the moment that you became interested in banking or finance or whatever role it was targeting. So we start here, we go back, and we're then going to work from there back to the present, and you'll see this unfold through the rest of the structure. So the next part of the framework is the spark, and this is essentially where you were, where you discovered that you were interested in banking and your focus essentially narrowed. So you're placing the listener in that context. So you're essentially answering, what was I doing when this path started to make sense? So this essentially covers what you were studying or working on, the environment you were in, and the particular moment or spark that led to an interest in banking. And this needs to be concrete and experience-led, not aspirational. And I'll show you what I mean by this. Okay, so a good example of this might be while studying chemistry, I realized I enjoyed breaking down complex problems under time pressure, and that sharpened when I was exposed to finance through a case competition. So this is a good spark. We've set the context, we were studying chemistry, we realized we enjoyed something particular, which was complex problems under time pressure, and that sharpened when you were exposed to finance through a case competition. That's the spark. Now, a bad example of this would be, I've always been interested in finance and knew early on that I wanted to work in banking. This is so generic, so aspirational. Everybody who's not done any preparation will say this. And so immediately the interviewer switched off. They're like, I've heard this a million times. This person is not serious. There's no substance. They've not prepared. And honestly, it's hard to recover from this moment. Okay, so we've set the opening and we've set the spark. Now it's about showing how we pursued this interest, and the first step of that is action. So this is essentially the first deliberate step that you took once that direction became clear. So it's not intention, it's not research, it's action. So this could be experience-based, i.e. you took on a particular role. It could be project-based, i.e. you started a particular project, or skills-based, i.e. you learned a skill relevant to finance and banking. What matters is that you chose it on purpose without being told to do it. So again, let's look at a good and bad example. So a good example would be, once that clicked, I started building valuation models on companies that I was following or I followed and applied for roles that would give me closer exposure. So this is a clear step. Once we know we're interested in banking or finance, we've started building models and we've started to apply for roles that would give me exposure. Now, a bad example is that I spent a lot of time learning about finance and researching the industry. There's no concrete action here. It's, again, very vague and generic. Most people will say this. There's nothing specific about this. So this is not a good example of the action step. Now, the next step is acceleration, which shows we went further. So we did not just stop at curiosity of that first step. We raised the bar. Now, this might look like more responsibility, greater technical depth, or repeat exposure beyond just one-off. And this is where your seriousness becomes visible without you even having to claim it. So again, let's look at some good and bad examples. So a good example is, I then took on more complex analyses and presented recommendations to senior stakeholders where pace and judgment really mattered. So here, we're taking on more complex analyses, so we're going deeper on the technical front, and we're assuming more responsibility. We're presenting recommendations to senior stakeholders. And this is obviously in the context of a role, but you could have other examples of how you accelerated your interest. Now, let's look at the bad example. Over time, I continued to improve my skills and grow professionally. Again, so generic. There's no concrete action here, wishy-washy. Anybody could say this. This is not personal. This is not well thought out. And honestly, this is going to be a poor example of your personal story. So at this point, we've detailed our spark and then our action and acceleration. So we're pursuing our interest. Now it's time to land the story. And this is where everything comes together. You're not pitching yourself, you're concluding the story. A strong close states what you learned or genuinely enjoyed. It explains why this role follows naturally, and it opens the conversation moving forward. You should sound settled and assured here, not salesy. You don't have to pitch yourself. And let's look at a couple of good and bad examples. So a good example of landing the story would be, those experiences showed me that I'm most engaged by fast-paced, market-linked work, which is why this role feels like the natural next step. So you can see we summarized what we learned to what we discovered, and then we've linked it to why this role makes sense as the next step. A bad example would be, this is why I believe I'd be a great fit and would bring strong skills to your team. Again, generic, we've not really concluded what we've learned, we've not linked it to the role, and we'll see in a second, we've also opened the door to being tested on why we actually think we're a good fit and what skills exactly we're going to bring to the role. Okay, so we understand the structure. Now let's look at common mistakes and how we fix them. And the truth is, most people don't fail this question because their background is weak. They fail because of how they structure and deliver their answer. So the first mistake is generic answers, and I've alluded to this a few times, but if somebody else can restate the exact story word for word, then it's not personal and it's not going to work. So to overcome this, we need to use the structure we just described, and we need to anchor each part in your specific experience, not motivation or ambition. The second mistake, which is very common, is rambling. People go way too far back and tell their entire life story and don't know where to stop, and the interviewer checks out. So to overcome this, again, we need to utilize the structure we just described and make sure we find a relevant spark which is related to the role we're applying to. And thereafter, everything we describe should again be relevant. Leave it to the interviewer to pull depth from your story. The third mistake is overselling at the end. It's essentially concluding with something like, that's why I'd be a great fit, or I bring all these great skills. You essentially turn the conversation into a test thereafter. So conclude your story, state what you learned and how it links to the role, and then hand it over to the interviewer to follow up with the questioning, rather than giving them ammunition to beat you over the head with. And the fourth mistake is sounding like a robot. Even the best story falls short if you sound heavily scripted. So it's key to recall the structure, the OSAL structure of your story rather than every word. And beyond that, for each part of the story, only have 2 to 3 bullets that bring the point to life, and don't memorize those bullets. The objective is to sound fluent, not polished. And so if you're too rigid in the way you learn the story, you won't be able to adapt, especially if you are interrupted at any point. So overall, structure, bullets, and rehearse until fluent. Now, if the pain of developing your personal story feels familiar, it's usually not an ability or effort problem. It's more that people don't understand how their background comes across. Most candidates have done enough, they just don't know which parts of their story are relevant. And this is the exact thing that I work with my clients at Charter Mastery on. We focus on making the logic of their story clearer. Now, in any event, let's look at what this sounds like when it's done properly. All right, let's look at some examples, and we'll start with a non-finance undergrad who's studying chemistry and is looking to go into banking. So the opening would be, I'm currently an undergrad at X university studying chemistry. Short, sharp, sets the scene, and then we go back. And because this person is still a chemistry undergrad, they don't have to go that far back to find the spark, but they start with, while I enjoy the subject, what I found most engaging was breaking down complex problems and working under pressure with incomplete information. So they've spoken about something they enjoyed, and this interest or that interest sharpened when I got exposure to finance through a case competition. So there's our spark, where valuation, judgment, and time constraints mattered far more than finding a single correct answer. Now you can see here, we opened and then we set our spark, and we've linked it to a few things that you would expect to see in banking. So valuation, judgment, time constraints, and these are valid sparks that in the end will link to banking. So next we have our first action. I acted on that by building valuation analyses on companies I was interested in and followed markets more closely to understand how news and assumptions translated into value. So there's our first action after our spark. I then pushed further by taking on more responsibility within the group, presenting recommendations and defending them under questioning. So this is within the case competition, and this is acceleration of our interest. What I learned from that is that I'm most engaged by fast-paced, analytical work tied to real outcomes, which is why banking feels like the natural next step. And I'm happy to go deeper on any part of this. So here you can see we've summarized, we've articulated what we learned, especially about ourselves, that we've said we're most engaged by fast-paced analytical work tied to real outcomes. And then we've said this is why banking feels like the natural next step. So we've linked it to this role. And then we've opened the floor by saying I'm happy to go deeper on any part of that. So you're not saying, I think I'm a very qualified candidate, I've got great skills, blah, 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 and turning it into a test. We're saying, look, based on all of this, this is why I'm here. This is why banking makes sense. And I'm happy to talk about this in any more detail, hand it over to the interviewer to drill into it. Okay, let's look at another example. And we have someone who studied economics, then went into FP&A within corporate finance, and now wants to move into banking. So they open by saying, I'm currently working in an FP&A role where I focus on budgeting, forecasting, and performance analysis. So a few things that are relevant to banking in one way, shape, or form. Then they go back to the spark. I studied economics and moved into a role after graduating, which gave me a strong grounding in financial analysis, but mostly from a reporting perspective. Over time, what stood out to me was that I was more interested in understanding how market conditions, strategic decisions, and capital allocation actually shape these results. So here, the spark is a bit longer because we had to go back and set the scene. So we sort of set a foundation. And then we're saying within that experience, this was the moment or this was the thing that I realized. So there's our spark. Next, we say I acted on that by taking on more project-based work, building business cases and scenario analyses tied to real decisions. So now we've started to do work that is more transferable to the banking ecosystem. So that's our first action. I then accelerated by working on more complex analyses with senior stakeholders where pace, judgment, and clarity really mattered. So now we're really stepping into essentially the modus operandi of working in banking. So essentially, this is our acceleration leg and now sets up the close or the landing. So what that showed me is that I'm most engaged by technically demanding market-linked work with real consequences, which is why banking feels like the logical next step. Happy to go deeper. So again, as we said, we're summarizing what we learned about ourselves here, and we're saying that we are most engaged by technically demanding market-linked work, which is definitely banking, with real consequences, again, banking, which is why banking feels like the logical step. Happy to go deeper. We're opening the floor. We're not trying to set up a test. So this is a great example of a personal story. Now, before we close, I actually want to drill into one thing, which is that this question, tell me about yourself, has a few permutations which are largely underpinned by the same story. Now, you might also be faced with the question, why banking, or walk me through your CV. And fundamentally, the components of the story are very similar, the emphasis just shifts. So far we covered tell me about yourself, which is a pretty balanced story. So you set the context where you are, you set the spark, and then you talk about the progression and the direction since that moment. Why banking is essentially the same story. You're going through the same motions. You may dwell a little bit more on the experience and call out some of the key skills and learnings from there which are related to banking, but fundamentally same story. Now, walk me through your CV is subtly different, but still somewhat related. So here, you're going to actually start where you are currently, so your most recent role, and you want to spend the most amount of time there because this also comprises the largest part of your CV. So you talk about what you've done there, what you've learned there, what's transferable to banking, and then you spend a bit of time on the 1 or 2 roles prior to that, again, calling out things that were relevant. And throughout this as well, you want to emphasize your achievements and your impact because it's not just listing responsibilities, it's also talking about what difference you made and why you are a good hire. But what I'm really trying to call out here is that fundamentally the preparation for all 3 of these questions is the same. And what you might be asked might be a little bit different, but if you prepared well and you have this OSAL structure in place and you've got some details for each of these stages, where you start the story might differ and how much time you spend on specific parts might differ, but the preparation is largely the same. So to conclude, a strong personal story is not about saying the right things. It is about starting from somewhere that's truly yours, showing progression and landing on this role as a natural conclusion. If you get that right, your story doesn't just answer the question, it actually guides the conversation. Now, if you want to apply this to your specific situation, not just in theory, but against roles you're really applying for, I work with a small number of people who are serious about breaking into banking in 2026. And the advice isn't generic. We actually pressure test your background and look at the signals your CV and story are sending and whether these actually map to the roles you're applying for. And the first step to do this is a strategy call, where we'll look at your background, your current positioning, and the roles you're targeting for, and ensure you walk away with clarity on where you realistically fit, what's holding you back, and what actually needs to change. So if you're serious about landing a banking role in 2026, there is a link to the strategy call in the description below. And otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then you're going to love the next one. I'll see you there.